Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. And direct, O Lord, all our actions by thy holy inspirations, and carry them on by thy gracious assistance, so that every prayer and work of ours may begin from thee, and by thee be happily ended through Christ our Lord. Amen. Our Lady of Victory, pray for us. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, so this conference is on fear and confusion, because we are seeing an awful lot of it, especially with the pandemic. What they're labeling as a pandemic is out there. People, the amount of fear that people actually have is actually pretty significant. In traveling around the country, what I've noticed is that the fear like on the East and West Coast is significantly higher than it is in other parts of the country, generally speaking. Because in the other parts of the country, people realize, okay, they're just going on with their lives, whereas the people on the East Coast and the West Coast, they seem to have drunk the media's Kool-Aid a little bit more than, say, the rest of everybody else. But the point being is that there's a certain level of fear that is now being used, I think, by the civil authorities, and even it's even affecting people in the church and that type of thing. But so what we want to do is talk about fear, the areas of our lives where we tend to see it, at least today. And then the other part is that how do you deal with fear? And then also, fear can also lead to confusion. Confusion can be the cause of fear, which is the first chicken or the egg, which whenever somebody says that, metaphysically, we actually know the chicken came first. So, and that's based on the principle that acts as prior to potency, but it's neither here nor there. Okay, so we want to talk about confusion, the nature of it, and how to clear it up. And then the correlation between confusion and fear. Okay. So the definition of fear, so that's the first thing we want to do, is start out with the definition. The definition of fear is a perception of a future evil which cannot be overcome. So it's the emotional response that we have at the perception of a future evil. So it's the appetitive response to a future evil which cannot be overcome. So it's something that's coming down the pike. It's actually not present. If it's present, then we have sadness. What's interesting is that from fear, so fear is this future evil, if the future evil is constantly present to you, then what happens is a form of sadness starts to occur where you're constantly dealing with this future evil coming down the pike, and that constant presence, when it becomes constant, that constant presence of the future evil begets a sorrow, a specific kind of sorrow, which we call anxiety. Anxiety is, St. Thomas defines as a fear as a result of a form of sorrow as a result of chronic fear. So what happened, this anxiety, so you'll notice this with some people. When people say, I suffer from anxiety, you have to ask them, well, do you suffer more from fear in relationship to the anxiety or the sorrow? And depending on what they answer or what you determine, if they suffer more from the sorrow, it means that they're in a more advanced stage of anxiety. Whereas if it's more predominantly on the side of the fear, it means that the sorrow that's beginning or the anxiety that's beginning is only at the beginning stages, and it's much easier to actually address. Okay, so it's a matter of the perception. So it's based on perception that there's this future evil. It's something that's coming down the pike, and as a result of that, I can't overcome it. I don't think I can overcome it. If I think I can overcome it, then I'm not afraid of it. Right? I might be annoyed by it. I might get angry by it, or etc. I might even get sad in relationship to it because there's this future evil. But the fact of the matter is that it's not. I don't have to worry about being able to overcome it. And this is the thing that you tend to see, for example, in relationship to the pandemic, is that people had a lot of fear because they were worried in the future that they might come down with the sickness, that is the evil, that's the sickness, And there's the way it was being portrayed is that there was no way to avert this thing. And the only way we can avert this thing is by this draconian locking down, etc. Which, if you actually had a real pandemic where people were dying en masse and everything from it, that would probably be legitimate. In fact, they've even done that historically in the past. But the point being is, once, and then as in some areas of the country, once people began to realize that they can overcome it, or that, this thing, okay, yeah, I might get COVID, but I'm more than likely not going to die from it. That means that they can actually overcome it. Then people stopped having fear in relationship to the thing, right? So this is one of the aspects which causes the fear to dissipate, is recognizing that I can overcome this. So sometimes the perception is in relationship to oneself. Can I conquer this, or can someone conquer it for me, and then I don't have to worry about it? And if they can, then then I'm not going to worry about it. They'll just make sure it gets taken care of by the guy that can do it. Whereas if I don't think that anybody can actually overcome it, there's no way to stop the spread of this thing. It's just going to go everywhere. And part of from fear can arise anger. Because the definition of anger is a perception of injury with a desire for vindication. Okay, so it's perception of injury with a desire for vindication. How does the injury is actually something present? Someone's done something against you that causes, that causes you to suffer some detriment in some way, and so you want to club them over the head, St. Thomas says. In order to, the desire for vindication is future. You desire to club them over the head in order to put an end to them hurting you. That's why you engage in anger. Well, what happens is you see this actually on videos where some guy's just walking down the street, he doesn't have a mask on, and then someone who does have a mask on comes up and literally just starts yelling and screaming at him uncontrollably at the fact that he's spreading COVID and grandma's going to die as a result of this, and and that's because the person has become angry because they perceive that the person not wearing the mask is causing them harm by not wearing a mask, and so that's why they club them over the head, etc. Okay. Now, even in relationship to anger, you see this also in how they foment anger and strife within a community is, in order to get people to start rioting and causing problems, which we're also seeing, which is basically a form of vindication, the rioting and where they're burning things down and things like that, is you have to foster in people a perception of injury, right? This is what they've done, and this is one of the reasons why, for example, when they show them, the white police officer shooting a black unarmed man, very often they make sure that the perception side of it, that you only see a particular side of it so that the narrative can be controlled, so that people will feel bad about it and then seek vindication. Obviously, too, you're also trying to hurt a specific part of the population in relationship to that. And so that's why, like a lot of white people will suffer, quote, white guilt, unquote. So, okay. That all being said, there is something, though, so fear can give rise to anger, but fear is actually the product of a very specific thing. So St. Thomas says that he just lays this out there, and it's actually very perceptive. He said, people have fear. That is, there's a future evil. Well, future evil is that you're going to suffer some kind of harm to either yourself or to something or someone you love. Okay. And actually, it's also that you love yourself, which is you want yourself to have the good, and so you don't, which is the definition of love, is willing the good of another. So when we love ourselves, we want our good to have ourselves. So when we see this future evil happening to ourselves, that's what actually gives rise to it. So he ends up saying that fear arises from love. Now here we're talking on the level of emotions. It's actually true even in the level of the will, but it's It's primarily on the level of the emotions. So, of the emotions, there is, St. Thomas talks about how there's, he calls it amor simpliciter, or love simply speaking. That is the most basic emotion that we have, and by that he just means that I just like a thing. In English, we would use the term like, because we're talking about an emotion. You know, like, I like steak, so people say I love steak. You know, I like lava cakes, right? So it's actually, you know, I'll say I love lava cakes, right? So this is just, on an emotion level, this is just a very basic thing that we have. The opposite of that is hatred, obviously. And he says amor is kind of an inclination to the thing. It's kind of a convergence towards it. I'm kind of inclined to want the thing, to be moved towards it. Whereas hatred is the opposite. I move away from it. I don't want to be part of it. Okay. That being the case, so when we say that so from love, that is, if there's something that I emotionally love, from that, like myself, or say our relatives, or even this can also pertain even to inanimate objects, or even to animals. It can pertain to anything that I have an inclination towards. That love, if that thing that I love, if there's harm that's going to come to it, whether it's myself or the thing that I love, from that, then he says, as a result of that, I see this evil coming, and if it can't be overcome, then as a result of that, I end up having fear in relationship to it. Let me give you an example. People have an emotional attachment, because, by the way, the name for love and like is also attachment. When I have an attachment to something, then what happens is that attachment, the love and the like and the attachment have a slightly different connotation. Attachment means that my emotion is actually already fixed to the thing in some way in which it's hard for me to turn away from the thing, that I'm actually fixed on it, whereas love means I'm inclined towards it. Now, the love is inclined towards the thing because of the fact that it's fixed, because there's a direction that it has. Something is fixed, or that is, it's held in place in relationship to something, and when I'm inclined towards it, I'm going towards that place, so to speak, in relationship to that. So what does this all mean? It means that if I have an attachment to anything, from that will arise all the other emotions: fear, anger, sorrow, all of that. So what does this mean? It means if I want to find out why am I having an emotional reaction to something? You know, aversion is one of them, all of that. Why am I having an emotion? It's because there's somewhere at the most fundamental level I have an attachment to the thing, okay? This is a key issue as to why people are so fearful in relationship to what's going on in our culture today, that is in our society, in our nation, as far as COVID goes. And what's the attachment? I think the most fundamental attachment that they're actually playing on is people's desire for well-being. That is, in the sense of their basic health, you know, or also just their life. You know, I don't want to die from this thing. You know, and what's so ironic is that dying is not the worst thing. I mean, and actually getting sick isn't the worst thing. The worst thing is offending God. But most people aren't even paying any attention to that, okay? So, that's the most fundamental thing that people, and we also have a natural inclination to this. So the first category of natural inclination is to be inclined towards the preservation. St. Thomas says the conservation of our being as it is. This is why he says as long as someone has the use of reason, they'll be naturally inclined towards you know, basically bodily protection and things of this sort. This is why it takes a certain amount of formation or deformation. St. Thomas actually says there has to be a certain misinformation and deformation over a certain period of time to get somebody to the point where they'll actually act contrary to the lower levels of the natural inclination. So, for example, people who want to go through transgender operations, it's a sign that they're mentally ill already. They don't have use of reason because they've gotten to the point where reason doesn't even see the self-preservation aspects of them. The point being is that the self-preservation and the life is the thing that a lot of people have an attachment to, both from natural inclination, but also just because of over the course of time, they've pampered themselves, they made themselves feel good and comfortable and things of that sort. As a result of that, they have a very strong attachment to their life, and so this is the thing that they're actually playing on. This is why, that the big moniker out on the mainstream media is "be safe, be safe, be safe," and that's what they're actually playing on. So the point being is that the reason people have all this fear in our culture is because of the level of attachment, and they're playing on this lowest level, but they're also playing on other forms of attachment as well. One of the things that I think that they're actually playing on is people's desire for a normalcy of life. They on one level, they don't want to give that back to them, but on another level, they kind of use that. Look, in order for us to get back to normal, we have to go through these draconian circumstances first to get there, which may or may not be true, but that's basically how they do it. So people's normalcy of life, which is actually part of the second and third categories of natural inclination, people just want to be able to have normal freedom and be able to come and go and do what's necessary, and also to provide for their family and things of that sort. So they're playing on that, and so from that, all this fear begins to arise. Now, fear, if you remember from the conference yesterday, the emotions are moved by what's in the imagination. So what they do is, through the senses, it is by the media and things of that sort, you have the way that you get people to the point where they're acting out of the fear, and that it becomes something that's debilitating and that they can't do except for what you tell them to do, is it has to be constant. You have to constantly be putting in their head what it actually is. Now, one of the things that is a sign, I'm not going to talk about this in my upcoming videos, but one of the signs that we're actually in a communist situation is the fact that communists have been known to use brainwashing techniques even on their own citizens. And we actually saw Hitler was one of the guys that kind of perfected that thing. And then in Operation Paperclip, we brought all these scientists over here, and then they started doing it in the United States. But basically, the cogitative power is the one that makes associations. And it's also the one that when it makes a particular assessment by the association that this thing is good or bad, which moves the emotions. So what you do in the relationship to the cogitative power when it comes to the senses is you pre-package in the senses. This is actually what movies do. This is what advertising does. This is what they all do in order to elicit a specific emotional response. It's not an evil mechanism of and of itself. It's actually a good thing if it's used properly. But what they do is they bring through the senses a pre-packaged association. It's pre-packaged. And so, for example, when it comes to COVID, what did they do? They show us all these different scenarios where the hospitals are overrun, and then you find out that they actually weren't even in the United States, they were in Italy and things of that sort. But the point being is they pre-package the association, and then to put the two things together, because then what happens is the cogitative power naturally sees those two things together and associates them with each other. And you just keep doing that over and over and over and over and over again. And then what happens is that over the course of time, the cogitative power becomes so habituated that every single time that people will see that, they will have an automatic emotional response. This is called conditioning, but this is actually how they brainwash people. They do the actual what they do is they use, so if I have say I have a particular association, what they will do is they will feed you constantly through the senses something that disassociates those two. This is actually how they brainwash. So you disassociate it for long periods of time to the point where the person no longer associates that with it, and then you start providing the prepackaged associations over the course of time in order to get people's thinking patterns to be in a specific way that you want. That's how you brainwash people. This is exactly what's going on in television. It's constant. They're literally brainwashing people if you look at the actual mechanism. I'm not saying that they're intentionally doing it. I think some are, but that they're not intentionally doing it, but they're constantly building up these prepackaged associations. And then the way they manipulate people, first of all, if you've noticed in the last 20 to 30 years, every single time they have some type of news story, especially if it's about a tragedy, they have someone, usually a woman or a child, sitting there crying and talking about how bad and everything was, to constantly build up these associations so that the next time this occurs, they'll get that emotional response out of you. That's exactly what's happened. So now we've got this scenario now where, all they basically have to do is do just a little bit. They just have to give you a prepackaged association. They know people will react either extremely or to a large degree, right? As I mentioned, actually, I talk about this in my book on psychology. The fact that movies and media can do this is actually a good thing, because you can if you use it to build the right associations in people's minds, it can actually be formative of people. But what they're doing now is they're actually changing all this. Okay, so the reason I'm telling you this is what? If you want to address the fear, the first thing you have to do is because it's the image and the imagination that they're prepackaging. You got to get the image out of your head. You got to get it out of there so that the cogitative power learns, no, look, these two don't go together. These two don't go together, right? And a lot of times reason has to look at it and change the image of, yeah, I know that they're showing me this image, but I actually know that this, and this also happened, and so I know that they're not giving me the full dope, right? So that's how I change my image, so that emotionally I can relate to the thing properly. So they're specifically trying to engender certain kinds of emotions, but what they've done is they've trained people to follow their emotions, and the reason being is because then they can just give them the prepackaged image, and then people will have the specific emotional response, because 99.9% of people make their choices and act based upon their emotions. They know that they can basically manipulate people. It's called social engineering. That's basically what's happening. Okay. So the first thing you have to do in relationship to the fear or any emotion that's disorder that you don't like, if you want to get rid of it, then the first thing you have to do, it has to come in two stages. The first is you have to get it out of your imagination, because the emotions are moved by what's in the imagination. So you have to get it out of your imagination, clear your head, get away from the news media, get away from this stuff from time to time in order to just kind of clear your head. Then that's the first stage. The second stage is then you have to change the image in relationship to the things that move the imagination so that your emotional response is different. And that's just by looking at it from a different point of view. A lot of times just using reason to kind of sort the thing out will kind of give you some clarity. So in relationship to fear, I think that the areas that they're playing on people the most is the political situation. They're creating a scenario where, Trump's not going to step down if Biden is elected, or, they're going to have to haul Trump out, or they're going to have to, in other words, they're setting up the situation to get people fearful of the upcoming election, okay? So that if it doesn't turn out the way that they want, then all they have to do is send you the prepackaged association, and it'll trigger people to do this, that, or the other thing, okay? So they're playing on people's political fears, which if you're watching the news media and the stuff about politics is upsetting you, it's a sign that there is an attachment somewhere in there. And that attachment can be a variety of things. It can be an attachment to one's political party. It can be attachments to which really there shouldn't be. I'm not saying you shouldn't be a member of a particular political party. What I'm saying is that you shouldn't have an attachment to it, because your ultimate attachment should be to the truth and to the common good of the society over and above even that. It's also the same thing that you'll hear. They did this quite a bit in the 90s, where they would basically say, if you're not in favor of this, you're not a patriot, right? No, a patriot is someone who seeks the common good of the country in which they live. That's the definition of a patriot. So that means that doesn't mean that I have to agree with your view of where our country needs to go, because that may or may not be in congruity with the common good. Okay, so you have to have detachment from the political party. You have to have detachment from the good of your country. It doesn't mean, and this is a very key thing, it does not mean that you don't work hard for that. It just means that you have to be able to put yourself into really working hard for the good of the country, the good of the church, the good of your family, etc., but still have a sufficient amount of detachment to where if it doesn't work out, then you can accept God's will, whether it's permissive or positive, in relationship to that particular thing. Okay. So there has to be detachment from political parties, the structure of government we have, from anything that you find that getting yourself upset or angry or fearful. That's a sign there's an attachment somewhere and you need to detach from it. Okay. If for no other reason than for your own spiritual benefit. The other area that they're working on is people's comfort of life and normalcy of life. This is one of the reasons why they just were throwing money at people, just indiscriminately throwing trillions of dollars into people's hands. And the reason being they were doing that is to keep people comfortable through this process. Because if people, if all of a sudden people started starving and had no money for food and they couldn't go buy food and this, that, and the other thing, their ability to try and shape and form the culture, the direction that they want would have broken down. So they have to keep throwing money at it. I'm not saying that that's what every politician's intention was, because I don't think it was. I think some of them were legitimately trying to keep the thing afloat, but I think some of them were willing to do that. And if not, that's at least the effect that it actually has. They're also the people's attachment to their families. The fact that people were definitely worried about, whether grandma who was living in a nursing home, was going to die or not. I mean, not that you shouldn't have legitimate concern and do what's necessary to protect grandma, but at the same time, you could see that they were playing on this conditioned response in relationship to grandma. For example, when they said, if you walk outside without a mask, you're killing grandma. Okay, put the two together. That's the association that they're actually doing. As one priest who's a good friend of mine said, wait a minute, weren't these the very people that were trying to knock grandma off a couple of years ago, through euthanasia and all this other jazz? And so this is one of the signs that they don't really care about the population. They're just only interested in manipulating it to bring about a set of predetermined ends. Okay. So then you've got attachments to the family. Another thing that's become really large is people's attachment to the church. People sometimes wonder, because they'll say, like, how did you know that? And I said, well, it's easy. You just unpack it logically. There's been several times I've said stuff and it became true, right? So, like, for example, 4 years ago, I said, if the lay people don't stop abusing the Eucharist, God's going to pull the Eucharist from their daily lives, and they're basically going to not have regular access to the sacraments. And that's not a prophecy like somehow or another. I don't have the gift of prophecy. People, it basically just boils down to, look, we know from the Old Testament, if God constantly gives you a gift and you're abusing it all the time, eventually he just pulls the plug on it, right? And that's what was happening. So now that basically is what happened. People don't have, they have a bit better access to the sacraments now, but they didn't have regular access to the sacraments for a while. And so this is one of the things that what ends up happening. And so now people are fearful that the church, because they have an emotional attachment to the church, and they have an emotional attachment to the things of the faith, they're concerned that the bishops are using the COVID thing in order to bring the church down, which I think some of them are, not all of them. I think some of them are actually good people. I don't necessarily think that they're making always the right decisions, but I think some of them are making the best decisions within the context of the circumstances that they have, etc. But the point being is that, so in other words, I think it's a bit complex, but people's attachment to the state of the church has become an issue in which they become very fearful about not getting access to the sacraments. How are the bishops going to, are the bishops going to give this back to us? What are they going to do to the priests who actually do provide the sacraments? What are they going to do with this and that? You have to have complete detachment from it. This is why John of the Cross said that the only thing we can have attachment to, he even mentioned, you cannot have attachments even to supernatural things. There's only one thing that you can have an attachment to, and that is God and God alone. So if you find yourself upset with how the bishops are handling this, or the fact that the civil authorities are, basically bossing the church around, which is a sign of the church's weakness at this stage, you have to have a certain level of detachment from that, if for no other reason than to accept the will of God, that we deserve this on some level. We deserve to be punished because of all the sinfulness of it. And people say, well, the people aren't that bad. There's a lot of good people. That may be, but a majority of the Catholics, it's like Bill Clinton. He was the one who discovered, by doing research, that 95% of Catholic couples either have or are currently using contraception. Then you also have, the Catholics are not any better about shacking up before they get married, generally speaking. So the point being is that the amount of sin that the Catholics are committing, we shouldn't be a bit surprised that, we end up with bad pastors and bad things are happening, and God's allowing the church to be afflicted for the sake of its purification, and that's what all of this is for. Okay, so the way you get rid of fear then is identify what your attachment is and work on detaching from it. That is, at least mentally letting loose of the thing and actually performing virtues contrary to what that attachment actually is. So in the case of, if you're fearful about what's happening in the church and what's happening to the church, you just have to start making acts of confidence and trust in God. It's part of the virtue of hope. I trust, God, I have perfect confidence in you, right? And then that's where it actually has to come, okay? Another thing, so that's fear. Then the next one we want to talk about is confusion. So, where does confusion enter into this? Well, basically, St. Thomas says you've got the cogitative power here, which the imagination. We have got the memory. Okay. So we have the possible intellect, which is the thing that makes an act of judgment by going back to the image. And confusion is essentially a state of judgment in which either conceptually, because the concept is in here, either conceptually, that is my concepts, or in my image, there are at least two or more contradictory things. So let me just get rid of that here. So either in my image, there's some type of conflicting information that I'm receiving from the outside, from my senses, or I have a contradiction between what I conceptually know and the image, and my intellect isn't clear enough in order to be able to say the image is wrong. As I mentioned before, you see an image, a specific video that they play on TV. Whenever they do that, the first thing that I do is suspend judgment. Because if the news media is putting something out and they're all talking about it and they're constantly talking about it, it's a 99%. I'd love to have betting odds like that. It's guaranteed that they're lying to you somehow or trying to deceive you in some fashion, and because they want to have a specific narrative, as they say. So what I do is then I'll get on the internet, start digging around, find out the full story, and then realize, okay, that's the nature of the beast. Okay. So, but when it comes to the image, so St. Thomas says, so confusion is when either in our image or in our intellect, there are two contraries, things that together can't be true at the same time. And so the person's like, well, is it this or is it that? There's a bit of confusion. So he says the way you overcome confusion is through elimination of one of the contraries, or eliminating of all the contraries until you get down to one thing which is likely to be the truth. So in the case of, like for example, I'll give you a perfect example of something that you tend to see. People have a natural inclination and a normal bias to want to think that, that the bishops, because they're bishops, that they're actually good people, or because they're priests, they're actually they're good people. And then they'll do things that are completely contrary to that, and then they're like confused. Well, I don't understand. Well, it's quite simple. It's because what's the contrary that you have? Well, so you see this bishop doing something evil. The contrary is that you presume all bishops are good. Well, that's just not true. So you got to eliminate that contrary, which is some bishops are good, some bishops aren't. So you have to eliminate that contrary so that when you recognize, okay, this person is bad, then you recognize, well, some bishops are bad. That doesn't mean all bishops are bad. We know that just from the fact that we have saints that are bishops. So that not all bishops are bad. And so that it helps you look that when you see that person, the bishop who's doing something bad, your judgment is more moderated, saying, well, we just have some bad bishops. Okay. It doesn't mean that all the bishops are bad. Okay. Now, so the first thing you have to end up removing the contraries. One of the contraries that can occur in the relationship to the image is in relationship to the emotions. If people have been conditioned by these prepackaged associations to have a specific prepackaged association in the cogitative power and therefore an emotional response, when reason recognizes there's not something quite right, one of the first things that has to happen is that the emotions have to be removed from the equation in order for the person's head to clear, so that in the acts of judgment it's easier to manipulate the image. Why am I saying that? St. Thomas says, and it's our own personal experience of this, he says, the soul can only engage predominantly in one activity at a time. Now, by that, he's not talking about the fact that our soul is actually, operating through our body and moving our blood around and things of that sort. Okay, so we all understand that. It can do those things. He's talking about here on the psychological level. On the psychological level, we can only be engaged with one thing predominantly at a time. So when the emotions are really strong, what that does is the association which caused the emotions, he says, when we have a strong emotions, it holds that association of that pertains to the emotion, it holds that soul captive in a sense, it holds that in the image, in the imagination, and it's hard to get it out of your head. We all experience this. When you get angry, it's hard to get your head cleared, right? Because of the fact that your emotions are holding this thing captive. So then what do you have to do? Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to move the imagination, not to try and think it through. At that stage, it doesn't work. If you have an emotion that you're having a hard time getting control of, trying to look at it from a different point of view is only going to make it worse. What you have to do is you've got to get the image entirely out of your head. So in the case of fear in relation, as I mentioned this, fear in relationship to the situation like in the church or that type of thing, you just got to clear your head. You got to get that stuff out of your head. You got to stop thinking about it. You got to stop looking at the internet. You got to stop looking at all these things that keeps putting this stuff in your head. And then once the emotions begin to kind of quieten down, then at that stage, the judgment can come in and start looking at things more objectively. Okay. So in relationship to the fear or the confusion that we're seeing in relationship to all the stuff that's going on in the church and in the church and in our society and our country, one of the ways that you're going to remove the element of confusion in relationship, especially if it's connected to any kind of emotion, is stop thinking about it, stop looking at that stuff, clear your head, and then over the course of time, you'll be able to look at it more objectively. So I tell people, just stop watching the news media. Because literally, it's 24/7 on this whole COVID. And the other thing is, too, is that, they'll have the sign that you can tell they're trying to basically brainwash us is the fact that they'll have a news story about ice cream or something like that. And they cannot tell you about the ice cream without bringing COVID into it in some manner. You're just like, they're obsessed about it, literally. And this is, it's kind of funny because one time this one person said to me, he says, the church is obsessed with sex. I'm like, really? Really? It seems to me that it's the news media that's obsessed about it. It's the stuff in the movies. It's the stuff in the culture. It's the stuff you see pandemically everywhere. If you want a real pandemic, that's where you see it. That's where the obsession is. The church only keeps talking about it because everyone's obsessing about it, right? Okay, so the point being is that the fact that the COVID is the mechanism by which they themselves are becoming obsessed with the thing. And so, and how do you know they're obsessed about it? Well, it's because of the fact that they're obviously emotionally attached to it. They're just ruminating it, because that's the other thing is emotions drive rumination. We just keep thinking about it over and over and over and over again. Is, they literally, if someone comes along and says, look, I don't think it's as bad as you want to say it, they just go ballistic. The emotional response, even their own emotional response has become prepackaged. It's already been preconditioned, so that they can't stand back and just say, okay, look, let's just talk about this rationally, right? They can't even do that. Okay, so back to the fear. The way you get rid of fear is get the stuff out of your head, start looking at it more objectively, become detached in relationship to it, start working on confidence in God and the virtue of hope. Then in relationship to the confusion, which can actually be connected to that and drive it, you have to remove the contraries. You actually see this also in the church. The confusion is the result of, you'll have a particular scenario where people, the church has said in the past, consistently said one thing, and now you've got members of the magisterium saying something completely opposite. And so there's where the contradiction ends up coming in, to where the confusion can actually arise, where you have to remove one of the contraries. Well, that requires a certain amount of theological principle to know when that which is from the tradition actually obtains over what any subsequent bishop is going to say. You have to know when that is the case and when it isn't. So, and that's how you actually end up removing some of the confusion. But a lot of times people, one of the ways you too can remove the confusion is stop thinking about it. Because you hear this, do you think Pope Francis is the real Pope? Well, stop thinking about it, because you get people that don't. In fact, I was talking to a friend of mine recently, and he sent me this whole thing on, how Pope Francis isn't the Pope. And I said to him, I said, I've got 6 academic degrees. I've studied this fairly extensively. I haven't read, several of the main authors that actually discuss this type of thing. And I'm a little reluctant to barge off into the discussion of this thing, and basically make judication about it when I don't have a full background and I can't basically, clear the air in relationship to whether, when the Pope is or when he isn't, right? Removed from office and that type of thing. I do have a pretty good idea of it, but again, I don't speak too publicly about it because of the fact that I just don't want to deal with the vociferousness of. I mean, one of the signs that that the magisterium's broken down is someone told me there is now 27 different versions of sedevacantism right now. 27. That just tells you that people aren't even they're using the same principles or aren't even on the same map, which also tells you, look, it's not our place to judge whether the guy's the Pope, it's the subsequent Pope's place to judge that. But that all being said. So with the confusion, you have to eliminate the contraries, you have to eliminate the emotions, and then as a result of that, the fear will stop to arise, and the confusion will dissipate. Okay. This, and that means there has to be a certain amount of study. One of the things that you have to be careful is, and this is one of the ways to overcome confusion, and it's also the way to deal with the emotions, there has to be a brutal attachment. No, attachment's not the right. Yeah, well, I suppose you can say it can be a legitimate attachment in one sense. But there has to be a brutal adherence to the truth and the reality above and beyond any emotional correlation or relationship that we might have to the thing that we're considering. In other words, a person has to be willing to follow the truth wherever it leads, regardless of the personal cost. Okay. If you're doing that, then what can happen is, because this is also something that's actually happening. So even with those people who don't actually believe that COVID is as bad as it is, now you've got false stuff being put out on their side to support their position here and there. It's hard to know whether it's people on the opposition doing that or whether it's other people who are just, disingenuous, or people who just don't know any better, or people who think it is. But this is the type of thing that we know from psychology, that when people adhere to a particular thing, they tend to selectively read about those particular things and tend to believe as true those things which adhere to what they emotionally want to believe, which is a bit different of a situation in which the person is trying to intellectually, regardless of how emotionally relates to the thing, come to the truth, and then once he realizes what the truth is, he still might take a look at the opposition, but not in order necessarily to discover the truth, but in order to basically be able to see whether it's actually true or not. But because his adherence to the truth, he's not going to get sucked into the opposite, but he is going to still adhere to the truth. But it basically means that he'll follow the truth regardless of whatever the personal cost is. And that part of that knowing the truth, as we talked a little bit about it in the last conference, is not judging things to excess. So you have to have a moderated judgment in all this stuff that's coming out, quickly jumping to conclusions or quickly going to this, that, or the other thing because it emotionally suits us is not helpful. So people have to kind of stop that. Okay. Any questions?
So just as a summary one more time, with fear and confusion, what are the virtues that we should pursue?
Right.
You mentioned hope.
Yeah, hope. Fortitude, because fortitude is the virtue that actually moderates fear. So developing fortitude. In a certain sense, all of them will kind of contribute to some degree to it, but it's primarily hope and fortitude. And under hope, it's confidence in God, trust in Him, that He'll take care of you, that He's not going to just hang you out to dry, etc. It doesn't mean you're not going to suffer. It just means that He's going to make sure that everything necessary for your salvation, regardless of what happens in the church, regardless of what happens in the world, will still be obtained. So there's on that side. In relationship to confusion, it's the virtue of studiosity, study. Not curiosity, where you're pursuing all these, various conspiracy theories, although some of them have turned out to be fact. You have to actually study so that you have the principles and the knowledge in order to judge properly. Yes.
So is constantly talking about the different situations in the church or the government or among people in power and stirring the pot per se,
Yeah.
an indication of fear or?
Yes, it is. It's a sign that the fear is driving rumination, and so the person has to be able to kind of there should be times, right now, obviously, there's going to be a somewhat elevated amount of discussion on it because of the circumstances. But at the same time, a person should be able to walk away from it and not be stewing about it or thinking about it. So it's kind of funny because G.K. Chesterton said, well, people who say that you shouldn't talk about politics or religion are removing the two things that are worth talking about. But that's not exactly what we're talking about here, obviously. What we're talking about here is the people who are constantly talking about it's a sign of rumination. They're ruminating about it, and the rumination is always driven by attachment. So they have to find out where they're attached and let loose of it. And it can obviously the attachment drives the emotion, which then drives the illumination, etc.
And then what about going to extremes in terms of worrying about technology and that sort?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. Someone sent me this this meme, and basically it says, that 5G is going to cause all this damage and this, that, and the other thing, which for me, the jury's out. My tendency is probably think it probably is not, but I'm not a scientist. But anyway, so 5G, and so they're using 5G to track your car everywhere it goes, and the only way you can do it is by eliminating these little tiny antennas, right, on your car. And basically it's the valve stems to your tires. So they've got this wire cutters to that, right? And they're suggesting you cut your, it's that, it's that. So there should be a certain amount of humor in relationship to it. And I think that my own personal opinion is, and this is pure speculation on my part, is that God at some point is going to pull the plug on the grid. And by that I mean in the sense of, for a period of time, not indefinitely, but for a period of time, having the internet, electricity, all that stuff go down in order to bring people to their senses. So, for example, at any one given time, 50% of what goes through the internet, bandwidth-wise, is pornography at any one given time. That's how we're not using this thing properly, right? So at some point, God's going to do that. And I think that sometimes, too, the technology, I think that, is it advancing? I think the real problem to the point where it's become a danger, I think it is in the sense, not that the technological advancement is bad. It's actually good. It's the use of it that's the problem. And the problem we have now is that we have a lot of people who are basically madmen who actually have high levels of technological know-how and are developing a lot of stuff technologically that could end up causing an awful lot of damage or danger. But the principles still apply, right? Technology is just one of those areas in our culture, so if you're getting worked up and fearful about it, you need to just be detached. Because detach from it, de-escalate everything, don't worry about it. I think you should take certain precautions and things like that, and if it becomes clear, that specific kinds of technology are actually being used negatively and we should avoid those particular things, then that's fine. But that should all be done on a very basic elementary research level, and it shouldn't be something that we're ruminating about and that type of thing. It should be something in which we come to that conclusion based on reason. The point being is that even in technology, we have to have a certain level of detachment. And really what that boils down to is we have to have a level of detachment from our physical well-being. By that I mean in the sense of, doesn't mean we don't take proper care of ourselves, because we should, because that's also negligence. But if God allows something to happen technologically, and as a result of that, like say they come out with some type of vaccination, they try and force everybody to receive the vaccination, God will provide a moral out for us. And even if we say we're forcibly vaccinated, then we also have to accept the fact that God's allowing us to suffer physically for a specific reason in relationship to this thing. I'm not saying that it's good. I'm not saying you should just go out and get vaccinated automatically. I'm just saying that we have to be willing to suffer those things. And part of the removal of the fear is recognizing that, it doesn't matter what they do to my body. When I resurrect, I get it back anyway, but perfected. So, if they inject me with some type of virus that then causes, genetic to my genes to be modified and this, that, and the other thing, it doesn't matter, because in the end, I'll get it back anyway. Now, for some people, getting the body they have back is actually a good sign. Other people, not so much. No, I'm just kidding. Okay. So, in other words, even in relationship to technology, there has to be, if there's fear, like I said, if there's any antecedent emotion or any emotion that's hard to control, or that you're finding yourself getting consistently worked up about it, you've got to gain the detachment, find out where the attachment is, and remove it. Okay. All right. If you'll kneel, I'll give you a blessing. Benedictio Deum omnipotentis Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti super vos et manet semper. Amen.